Hey guys. We're about to watch together The Snot That Ate Port Harry, with me rambling along through the whole thing to talk about the making of it and stuff that went wrong during it, all the roadblocks that I encountered, technical difficulties, weird behind the scenes issues, even a natural disaster that played a part at one time, and a ton of stuff that I would do very differently during the making of it. If you haven't seen the movie itself yet, though, I would definitely say check that out before you watch it with the commentary, with me talking here. And I'll give you a little bit of a heads up here, a little bit of an introduction to kind of what we're looking at. So this is the second movie that I ever made. The first film was the Case of the Midnight Murderer, which is a film noir parody, and that movie was made very much on a whim. I wrote the script kind of as a writing challenge, an exercise sort of, based on a short story I had written in high school, and it kind of just evolved where all of a sudden I was storyboarding it and designing characters, and I was like, screw it, let's make this thing. And that was a very dialogue heavy movie, a lot of medium shots and close-ups of people talking and stuff like that. And all things considered, it went pretty fast. I did the animation relatively quick, considering I did it all myself. And it turned out like it won a couple of awards at some film festivals, and people seemed to like it. In the minimal audience that it got, mind you, and I was kind of inspired to do it again. I kind of thought maybe I could do another movie, and with everything I learned, I could do it just as fast, if not faster. And if I put a little bit more time into developing it and stuff like that, maybe it'll be that much better or whatever. Um, and I wrote this one actually based on a joke that my dad used to say when I was a kid. Whenever we would talk about what movie are we going to watch tonight, because we watched a lot of movies as a family, and he would often say, "The Snot That Ate Port Moody." Port Moody is where I grew up in BC, Canada, and so I didn't use Moody. I changed it to Harry. I wanted a fictional town, but that was kind of the genesis of it, and I thought I could do it similar to Midnight Murder, but it would be a parody of classic monster B movies from the 50s, as opposed to film noir films of the 40s, like the last one was. And I figured I could do it in at least the same amount of time. It took me about a year to do the animation for Midnight Murderer, and that was while I was also working on other projects and doing freelance stuff. I had to put it aside here and there. So I thought, okay, well, if I can do it even more efficiently now with what I learned, I could probably do it just as fast, and it'll be even better because it'll be the second movie I made. One of the criticisms I put on myself for that first movie, though, was that I thought it was so dialogue heavy that it kind of got a little bit stale at times. I don't know if other people felt that way necessarily, but I felt that way about it. So I ramped up the action in this one and stuff, and as a result, it became much more technically challenging. So it took me the same amount of time it made to make that entire first movie I spent on the final 20 minutes of this movie, because it involved so many effects and crowds of people and all this kind of stuff. So it took, all of a sudden, done about 2 years to do the animation for it. I also encountered a technical issue. There was a weird rendering issue that I think took me 2 months to figure out. So that was a big stall right in the middle of it and everything as well. And then when I finally finished the animation, I didn't trust myself to do the audio necessarily. I thought the audio was kind of weak in that first film. So I tried to outsource the audio, and I didn't have a lot of money to work with. I didn't want anybody to work for free. I don't like asking anybody to work for free ever, but it was kind of a minimal amount that I could afford to pay, so I kind of did a pass of the audio myself, hoping that someone else could just clean it up and kind of make their workload a little bit more minimal to kind of justify what I was able to pay for them. And I did that, but there were hiccups along the way. They doing the audio got stalled. I had somebody doing music for me as well, and they had some technical issues in themselves. They were living in, they were going to school in Florida, and a hurricane hit, and they had to evacuate, and then they couldn't do the work on the music when they were hoping to. They came back. They were in school at the time. They had exams coming up, so they had to stall being able to do the music, which stalled being able to do the audio. By the time the music was done, the people that were doing the audio just didn't have the time anymore, and that was a whole big back and forth before anybody was basically able to admit this, they're not going to be able to do it. And things kind of just got stalled and stalled and stalled and stalled. So I had put tons and tons of effort into actually getting the animation done, like burnt myself out hardcore to get that far, and then we just sort of sitting on this thing for a while before it was ever actually done. And by the time it actually did get done, my whole view of the whole thing, my whole opinion of how I would approach this story and how I would design these characters and how I would do everything was so different. It's fairly close, I think, to the film that I set out to make. It's just that by the time it was done, it wasn't necessarily the film that I would set out to make if I was starting it at that point. The movie was finished in 2019, I think it was, or 2018, and then I ended up doing a few more edits in 2019, so you could say 2019. And I actually even had a huge stall before I could even show like friends and family and people that did voices in it and stuff like that, because of COVID. COVID happened. By the time it was done, I just needed to take a break and not even think about it for a while. And then I was like, okay, let's put together a friends and family screening. Oh, pandemic, can't do it. So that was even delayed as well. It was a tumultuous project that stretched me very, very thin. But let's take a look at this movie, and we'll talk even more about it. So right off the bat, we have James Dashel from my first film with the new Outhouse Cartoons logo. The first movie had the old, really bland Outhouse logo, and I updated it. And this disclaimer I had the idea for pretty early on. I thought it was kind of fun. I think it was based on something, but not necessarily an old B movie. It was based more on the trailers that like William Castle would do, where he tried to oversell how scary his movies were. The first movie that I did was all done in black and white, so I thought it'd be kind of fun to start this movie black and white and then switch to color, and then anybody who saw my first film maybe would assume this is going to be a black and white movie, and then be like, oh shit, it's color. I think that lizard guy could have been better animated. It's passable the way he kind of goes up there, but it could have been better, for sure, I think. Sometimes I have mixed feelings about this whole opening sequence. I could have got a bit more drama out of it, maybe. I mean, it's obviously going for comedy, but that boat in the background is from Creature from the Black Lagoon. A weird thing I have is you notice that the characters actually are leaving behind footprints in the sand. Some more so than others, but they are there. And I'm proud of myself for putting that attention to detail in there, but sometimes I feel like I could have cut back on that and maybe put a little bit more emphasis on some of the animation. I think the animation varies from really good to really not that good at times. But I am my own worst enemy, I realize, of course, with that. And you see that guy walks with one foot. He's kind of poking out, and I think my logic at the time was that it's such a quick shot, no one's going to notice it, and he's on sand, and you stand weird on sand, but I don't know if I would still feel that way now. I've watched it so many times, I can't let myself get away with that now. Here, I think it's pretty cool. I'm pretty okay with the way this stuff works out. I don't know how many people get that that's supposed to be the lizard at the very beginning that's now dead, but it is. I think it's kind of a dramatic setup, so I'm pretty okay with these shot setups here. As well as her gingerly stepping on the branches and stuff. Megan Glennie, who I've known my entire life, is the voice of Bonnie. And this was a little rough for her to do what she's about to do here. We've purposely saved this to the very end. You can see for a split second, you can actually see that the blood on the guy in the foreground that is there for like really, really quick actually is in color. That's a nod to the Tingler that had red blood in an otherwise black and white movie. And this title animation is by Nikki Jalali. She did the effect for me. As an homage to The Thing Thing from Another World, and then John Carpenter did the same thing for his remake, which is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. And this music, by the way, is by Luc LaChapelle. And my thought, because of the limited budget, was that I would get him to score just the climax of the movie, the final 20 minutes, because I knew that music was going to be really important to string all that together. But he insisted on scoring the entire thing. He wanted it to be all his, which was very good of him. I did up his pay a little bit as a result, but still did not make as much as he should have for this. But at least it wasn't free. I'm at least proud of that. This whole opening title sequence is somewhat self-indulgent, just because I like title sequences. And the only reason I say it's self-indulgent is because you don't see them too often anymore. Most of the credits are usually saved for the end. People's attention spans aren't what they used to be, so we usually try to get into the movie a bit quicker with more modern movies, but they were commonplace in the 50s, so I figured I'll at least put a moving camera behind it and everything, so it's not totally static, was kind of the idea. The names in this jukebox are a mix of people on the soundtrack of the movie and just people from the era. The perspective on those buttons is a little dodgy. Now, if you look at her dress, or a few of these dresses actually, that's an area where I think you can see that I was stretched a little too thin on the animation duties a little bit, because for subtle movements you can get away with just skewing a skirt back and forth. It's not that big of a deal, but to really get it looking like, for her skirt, that's fine, but for a longer skirt or dress, you really should be redrawing it to get like a good more flowy movement like fabric actually would do. Same thing with longer hair as well. And but I was burnt out. I had done a lot. I had burnt myself out already a little bit at this point, and I still had most of the movie left to do. I started with the climax, and then I went back to the beginning and started from there. And I think again my logic was like, oh, it's such a quick shot, right? Which is not an attitude I would take to it now, but at the time it felt like I needed to for the sake of my sanity. I was like, that shot, I thought that was a cool shot. You know, the early days of TV, so I feel like people really would probably look through the window with excitement. I was not born during this era. I actually made an entire atomic safety video, which I think I have on YouTube somewhere. All of the victims that the Snot kills during the second act of the movie are visible at some point in this opening montage. Now, in the 50s, like I said, the credit sequence that I had is fairly commonplace. By the 80s or 90s, they probably would have played over that montage. So it's almost like a double sequence, which is a little weird, but this is a very dialogue-heavy scene that's setting up a lot of character stuff. So you'll notice it says Exposition 101 on the door behind them. That is not an accident. If you noticed it, I would assume that you would know it's not an accident. Now, you're going to hear me be pretty harsh on the animation throughout this, and it's because I'm self-critical and I know I'm capable of doing better. And I know how much I was stretched thin and how much more I probably would have done if not for that fact. But I don't think that... I think there is some good animation in it though as well. I think some of this character stuff is pretty good, especially for Mary Bell there. There's a lot of background gags squeezed in throughout this. So many that sometimes I don't even remember what I was referencing with some of these things. Like there was a... somebody just walked by with the soundtrack for... it was a parody on South Pacific, but I forget what I made it into. And I made it so soft focus. Sometimes I come up with these gags, but then they distract too much from the story stuff that's going on, so I have to like subdue them in some way. They're barely even there anymore. Perspective on that background implies that we're kind of looking up at the characters, which I guess kind of works, but that was not the intent. It was just me using what I had to work with, I guess. I had this whole thing I did it in my first movie as well, where I rough everything out for the backgrounds with a ruler, and I do all the proper perspective and everything. But then when I kind of do my cleanup, my inking pass, I purposely don't use a ruler to give it this kind of rough, wobbly line. And it's a deliberate choice, and I don't know that there's anything wrong with it. I think I'm not the only person to do that kind of thing, but I don't know if I would do that again. But that's just a personal taste thing. I don't think it's necessarily wrong. It's just, I think I've outgrown that attitude a little bit.
I don't think I'm really ready to start dating.
By the way, like I said, Bonnie is Megan Glennie. Johnny Gibb is Chris Peters.
What's the matter, Johnny?
That's Valerie Boucher.
Bonnie not interested.
And her sidekick is Ryan Shemery.
She's interested, fine.
Bonnie's friends, by the way, are Mike Steele, Andrea Nakamoto, and Tiffany Buchanan,
Ouch.
who has since gotten married. So she's not in Canada anymore.
Ooh, think girls now give her? You are fine.
The timing, okay, I have two issues with that move. I think the timing's a little weird. I like the idea how she catches him as she tries to push her. But because of the way I should have redrawn his hands, because it totally looks like he's trying to grab her boobs, which is not the intent.
It was Billy.
But this is a good time to mention character designs. I like some of the character designs. I like Hetty and Stu quite a bit. But you'll notice most of these girls have really tiny waists and giant boobs, which is not something I would do again. It was kind of a deliberate choice. It was a combination of things. It was a criticism I put on myself for that first movie was I thought the character designs were a little stale. They weren't like, I didn't feel like I pushed the proportions and exaggerated and made them cartoony enough. So I was like really trying to think silhouette, just really like exaggerate shapes. If they were going to be big, they were going to be really big. If they were going to be small, they were going to be really small. And then in addition to that, it's a parody on B movies and monster movies and stuff. And usually they're very kind of, the casts of that tend to be very voluptuous and stuff, right? And they're very like kind of pinup model-y. And pinup art itself from the 50s was a bit of an inspiration as well. And I think all of that stuff together made for some very ridiculous proportions, which would be fine if it was just one or two characters, but it's just like so many of them have that in common that I think that was a mistake. And the movie also has a very deliberate like theme going on with kind of how like girls were seen and portrayed in the 50s and stuff, and then being very boy crazy and stuff, but then Bonnie kind of breaks the mold, which I think was a good idea, but I think that those weird proportions and stuff maybe kind of steps on that a little bit. It kind of it almost becomes the thing that it's trying to comment on a little bit. So so the character designs are definitely a major thing that I would change. Maybe not drastically, like I like the faces and stuff like that, but I would definitely change proportions and things. That fish was inspired by the creature from the Black Lagoon. It was kind of his face turned into a full fish. And one of the earliest gags I had for this whole thing was that no matter what, Dana always has this pipe in his mouth. Without exception. And this is Dana's voice, by the way. So I enlisted quite a few friends to do voices, and it would usually just be like, come over for a couple hours, we'll hang out, put a mic in front of you for a little bit of it, or pizza, or we'll go for lunch or whatever. Try to keep that fairly casual. I did try to somewhat get volunteers to do very simple background animation to help fill out some of these crowds so that I could just focus on the foreground characters. But I didn't want to put anybody on the spot and make them feel obligated or whatever. So and I don't know how many people even saw when I put that out into the world, so I didn't get too many on board. And the thing with animation is I'm not so much of a control freak that I have to do the animation myself. But I do want it to look a certain way. And it's not even just the quality of animation, it's just what I have in mind for timing and stuff like that. But if I don't want to ask anybody to do anything for free, any significant amount of work at least. But I'm sure as hell not going to ask for revisions. So it's just sort of like, it's going to take longer to do it myself, but at least I don't need to piss anybody off. This is Michael Boucher as General McGarthy, by the way. McGarthy with a G, not with a C.
No, sir, I don't believe I have.
I think I could have worked on this gag, by the way, with Dana's t-shirt. I like the idea of him being stuck wearing a shirt that's too small for him and maybe out of character for him, but I probably could come up with a better joke than Sugar Plum. The Getty in the background. This is an example of something that I
understand.
made a conscious decision after my first movie. I was like, that first one, like I said, it was very dialogue heavy. So here, my thought process was if people are talking, try to get them moving around the environment at least a little bit. So at the very least, there was a moving background and stuff. There was a little bit more visual stimulation.
They always do.
You'll notice too that when Dana speaks, anytime his mouth kind of goes like outward, like kind of, that's when some smoke will puff out of his pipe. The smoke animation wasn't that much work, so that wasn't really a concern about workload. It was just sort of like how much is too much, so I just decided to limit it to certain amounts. I like the flipping around disguise reveal gag. If I was to do this again, I would probably keep a lot of the more consistent gags, and the essence of the plot would probably be similar, but I would mess around with the pacing of it, and certain, like that introductory scene of all the girls in the high school would probably be very, very different. To kind of maybe set up the more satirical edge. I think it'll lean into a lot more meaning, you know? Like this is there's a mild attempt at some commentary with, like I said, how teenage girls were looked at in the 50s. Just based on what I've seen and read and everything, of course. I don't have experience as a teenage girl at any point, let alone in the 50s. But there was that, but that was mild, and then the rest of it is really just goofy kind of fun. And I had nothing against that as an audience, but I think for something I was devoting so much time to, I kind of wish I put a little bit more thought into the theme in the meeting, because I could have made it just as goofy and silly, maybe even more so, but also made it maybe even funnier and also had a little bit more depth at the same time. I think I could have had my cake and eat it too if I'd really committed to it, is what I'm trying to say. I made a whole bunch of background characters, but then I also took those background characters and as well as the main characters, and I kind of like broke them all up into pieces and Frankenstein them back together in different orders so I could fill out the backgrounds with more variety of people without having to make everything from scratch, which I think was a good idea. But going back to my criticism of some of these character design elements, those ridiculous proportions end up even more common because so many of the background characters are reconstructed versions of the other characters as well. I think when I designed that car, the Port Harry Police Department logo was lower on the door, which would probably make more sense, but I wanted to make sure it was visible in that frame. This is Callan Bouchard as the voice of Doohickey.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you.
Think nothing of it, Doc. My wife will be glad to have you. Pardon me. Allergies this time of year.
Thank you for meeting me here. I didn't want to waste
There's another example of an attention to detail with the saliva or snot or whatever on his belly there, but it took the time to do that, but now it was the time to break up other stuff or animate stuff a little bit more fluidly than I could have. I should say, as much as I tear this movie apart, I do think it was a large accomplishment for sure, and that hand could have been broken up and animated, feel less frozen, a little bit less cut out. And I am proud at least of finishing of kind of achieving it, you know. Well, even if I wish I had done everything drastically different, and the learning experience I think is pretty invaluable. I definitely would like to make another movie under slightly different circumstances, but that movie will hopefully and probably be that much better because of the experience having made this. So I don't really have any regrets necessarily, but I guess like most artists or creators of anything, it's hard to look at something that you know you could have done better and not tear it apart. That camera move was kind of cool, by the way. We're doing like this is cutout animation, which for anybody that doesn't know, is where you create all of your elements on separate levels and you animate it by rotating things around. And what a lot of animation, especially on TV now, a lot of it is kind of a mix of cutout like this and frame by frame animation, which is more traditional classic animation. And the idea is that you can kind of get away with certain movements pretty seamlessly with cutout, but other stuff not so much. And if you're blending it well, it won't necessarily be obvious when it's one versus the other. And so one criticism that I put on it is I probably could have done I could have switched to frame by frame a little bit more frequently than I maybe did for some stuff. Although as long as your characters are broken up into like a lot of pieces, and you're really thinking things out and you're kind of creating your characters with every possibility in mind, you can do a lot with cutout before it has to look that much like cutout. Like that action there of him catching and flipping the gun, I think is pretty smooth, I think. But when you're working this way, three-dimensional camera moves become a lot more of a challenge, because if you're redrawing everything anyway, then that's not that big of a deal to redraw it at varying angles and stuff, right? So I sometimes found kind of clever, if I can say, ways to get around that if I wanted to do certain things. So when he's looking at that meteorite, with the camera moves, I have a branch across the foreground, which makes sense. We're in a jungle. There's tons of stuff in the foreground, and when it passes the foreground, it actually has a mask wipe, so it switches to a different version of the character and the environment, so that we can kind of switch from a low-angle shot to a more eye-level shot. And if you're looking for it, it's not that hard to catch, but hopefully in the context of everything else, it doesn't really stand out that much. This scene, when radiation is first brought up, and then it is continually brought up throughout the movie. Well, the teacher brought it up earlier as well, but that sound, that little bit of music, that little stinger, that dun 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 type of thing that Luke put in there, that was how I knew that Luke really got the movie, got what I was going for. He got the joke. He understood the assignment. I think his music throughout this whole thing is very well done, and I think it elevates the movie. I think for sure. I do think and hope that once I have another movie under my belt, I might look back at this one and enjoy it a little bit less critically. By the way, it was Kevin Stinson, by the way, as Rob and Bob. All the commercials and stuff you see, most of that came, I added that at the end. I animated all this stuff with like just a blank TV screen and edited it together that way as well. I didn't know what I wanted necessarily, and I decided that a bug spray ad following the ant attack would be good. By the way, the ant attack was a reference to Them, which was a very big monster movie at the time in the 50s. It was one of the first ones to get some studio recognition, actually. And this is my parents doing Bonnie's parents here. That's the voices. Always gotta give mom and dad a cameo. This was a pretty big change, actually, that came in at one point, kind of last minute, I think, right before I started animating it. This is Sean Davis's voice as Salesman Dick, and he's gonna try to sell her a vacuum cleaner, which was a common thing in the 50s, a door-to-door vacuum salesman, or at least it's a common trope. Maybe it wasn't as common as it's made out to be, because I wasn't alive. And this is here to set up something for the climax later on, because I had this arc going the whole time where Bonnie kind of goes from being really syrupy sweet, maybe even bordering on annoyingly syrupy sweet, to being kind of a badass running through rubble and stuff later on. That was always the intent, but I didn't really have a lot for her to do other than just survive. And at the same time, I thought it was kind of lame if Dana invents this like laser ray to fight the Snot, and then it just works on the first try, which is how it was originally scripted. It was like, that's not very dramatic, right? So then I thought later on, well, what if something's wrong with it, and it's Bonnie that figures out how to fix it? And so I went back and I added in the salesman thing, which I thought was a better gag anyway. That actually replaced the joke where Bonnie actually had a creepy uncle that lived with them. He was an artist that was always asking her to invite her friends over to pose for his pinup art, and it was just weird. It wasn't really that funny. It was just sort of me like trying to throw shit at a wall and see if it stuck, and it probably would have got cut anyway, even if I hadn't added the vacuum bit. But once I had the vacuum bit, there wasn't even any question that whether or not I would change that. I like the gag for Doohickey here. Both the fact that he puts his hat on top of the mask, but that he doesn't even fit in it, so it's obviously useless as a radiation suit. Plus, he probably added a hole by pinning his badge to it. Even though this is like a sci-fi movie, what makes it sci-fi is a monster thing, right? There's not a lot of opportunity to do like crazy sci-fi designs and stuff. These radiation suits are fairly realish to what I think existed at the time, but I experimented with a whole. I drew so many radiation suits to try to justify doing something a bit more fun and sci-fi-ish, and I couldn't land on one that I thought worked across the board. This 3D camera move I think works okay, but I think the animation on this creature could have been done a lot better. This effect was by Sarah Lanthier. She added a warpy effect for the mucosa vision.
That's right, Principal Cook. First thing in the morning.
So one of the running things, and I get this just like, I don't even know where I picked this up, but I feel like it was kind of like a thing through cartoons and sitcoms and everything when I was growing up, that like women were always like really into doctors. And so I figured if I had this movie set in the 50s about a small town, and then you have a big city doctor that comes to town, then like that, just leaning into that trope, wherever the hell that came from, I just felt like all the women would be swooning over him in some way, shape, or form. So Bonnie's friends do it, and then Sarah does it. Sarah, by the way, was Mandy Bouchard, Callan's wife.
What do you think this is all about? Maybe someone else went missing. Who was killed? Mark, in the newspaper. Maybe the bomb's gonna go.
Something I added to later on is I actually brought Megan back to record a bunch of new lines for Bonnie. Bonnie's really prominent through the whole thing, but the movie is less talky than that first movie that I did. And so I looked at it as her being just as big of a character as Dana, but then when I actually played it back, because Dana's got so much exposition that he's always talking, and I realized that when we recorded stuff, she really doesn't talk that much, despite having just as much, if not more, screen time. And I also thought she doesn't come off as smart as I had envisioned her, so I came up with a lot of her one-liners and stuff got added later on, like syphilis and a pompadour there and stuff. Also, by the way, that thing there with the teacher just screaming into the mic, that was supposed to be a callback to a lecture he's giving in the class earlier. Originally, when he's introduced, he was talking about the Tingler, which, look up the Tingler. It's a William Castle movie from the 50s about a creature that lives inside of your spine, and it tries to escape every time you're scared. But when you scream, it holds it at bay. So I had him do this whole thing that was a reference to that movie, and him screaming there was supposed to be a nod to that. But then I changed that, never changed the scream, and now it's just there and doesn't really make a lot of sense. Your Hair and You, I'm pretty proud of that that gag. Probably could have put a bit more effort into the cover. A lot of the covers and posters and magazines and things like that you see through the movie actually do have like a full design on them. I always it's one of my most it's something I have the most fun with when I'm creating like a world for a movie or a comic or something to be set in. But sometimes if it's a joke that I thought of later on, um, I just throw something together really fast. I'm not necessarily putting that same amount of effort in. And then also for the joke to land, the text has to be unnaturally large too, so it almost would have been a wasted effort anyway, I guess. That basketball that bounced by earlier was supposed to be like a tumbleweed. I don't know if it lands. I don't know that it lands.
So, what do you think? My hunch now is that none of these kids know anything
Thank Yoda for soft focus. It helps these crowd scenes feel very full and alive with minimal animation.
I can tell you that.
wasn't a kid.
See, the poster behind them is the Excitement Under the Stars dance, which is supposed to be a nod to Enchantment Under the Sea from Back to the Future. And that guy on his head a second ago had a book To Serve Man, which is a nod to Twilight Zone. Her line, I think, made more sense in my head, whereas I have better things to do with my time, and assemblies ain't one of them. Because the assembly's already been canceled. There's not really a reason for her to make that line, but whatever. I think the shot's kind of cool. I like just how living there the whole time. There's a little weirdness with when the background stops pulling back. I probably could have tweaked that a little bit better, but Hetty probably is my favorite character design in the movie, actually. And her dialogue and Doohickeys dialogue is probably some of my favorite stuff. This from a writing perspective, at least. This is Adam Hollis as Buckets McGackie. Buckets is named after a fictional character that I think my grandfather invented. I never met this grandfather, but my dad would reference this character named Buckets McGackie. And had no idea who he was. My dad included, I don't think. Or unless he just hasn't told me that part. So that's where that came from.
Hey, it's your red. Just trying to throw in a little showmanship, you know?
You're going to see he's going to shotgun a beer in a minute here. And that was actually Adam's idea, who did the voice. I showed him the drawing, and he said, "Oh, it'd be cool if I could shotgun a beer using my hook." And I thought that was a clever idea, and I wanted to work it into the movie. But then the framing didn't necessarily work, so I actually switched what hand had the hook, just so I could do that gag, because I liked his idea. For anybody that really enjoyed this, I hope I haven't been ruining it for you by being so critical. But it's just hard for me not to be.
Gosh, I never thought about that.
All this strange stuff going on can't be a coincidence, can it?
No way it's coincidence. All this stuff gotta be connected.
So,
Maybe it's one of those,
Mike doing the voice of Mary Bell, I don't even remember exactly 100% where that idea came from. But part of it is he plays a grizzled detective in Midnight Murderer, and I think the idea of doing the polar opposite, I think, really stood out to me. I think that was a big part of it. By the way, in the background of this whole movie, if you're paying attention, the entire plot of Invasion of the Body Snatchers plays out. We just passed some pods and stuff, but very easily missed, especially with all the other gags going on there, like this one. That's the man from Planet X, I think, is what that's referencing. The idea of him being a peeping Tom was definitely inspired by Back to the Future, for sure. It was kind of, I came up with it as a plot device just to kind of keep Johnny into it. I feel like every monster movie, horror movie, slasher movie, whatever, like, you always have to have that douchebag character that you're excited to see die. And I decided the classic 50s jock with the Letterman jacket and the pompadour and everything was going to be that character. Um, but I had to have I also couldn't justify why he'd be hanging around with Bonnie and stuff. Like, I think Bonnie becomes a much less likable character if she's okay with Johnny being in her life. So I just needed to have him active enough that he could have that triumphant death moment, um, without just tagging along on areas that he shouldn't be tagging along on. By the way, well, actually, I'll say two things here. One of my favorite pieces of animation probably in this entire thing is Bucket's little monologue that he just did. And the best way to do cutout animation is to actually rough out all your key poses frame by frame. Not necessarily every single frame of animation, but just like your key poses. And then that kind of forces you to make whatever adjustments you need to your character assets to get them into those poses. And then find a way to move them from pose to pose in a way that makes sense and is fluid and everything. And the results are way better when you take that approach. But if you don't take that approach, it's really easy to just kind of go with what's easy. Just take what you have and rotate it and skew it and not draw stuff and everything. And if I had done that through the entire thing, I think I would have been a lot happier with the animation overall. That's an ant leg there to kind of imply that maybe more ants got mutated, but the snot that we're about to meet killed them. So what I was going to say too is earlier when they're in the jungle, you see the shadow being cast from all of the leaves and branches overhead, and the way I did that was by making a shadow layer that covered everything, and then once the animation was done, I would copy and paste the animation and turn that into a mask so it only landed on the characters. But it caused a huge thing, and for some big shots, it would sometimes take forever to process when I would have to do the different steps involved to actually make it work. So much that I would sometimes plan my evenings around like getting it started, go make dinner, get the next one started, eat dinner, get the next one started, and so on. I think this scene is one of the first things I envisioned how it would play out, the reveal of the Snot monster. By the way, there's not really a good reason for why the Snot would take the meteorite. It was mainly to give reason for people to go hunting for it and to kind of get rid of it. I later thought of an idea that I really liked, what would have explained that, and it would have also played into the climax, but the only way it would have worked by the time I had the idea would have been to change a lot of what I'd already done, and at that point it just seemed not practical, and it was just sort of like at a certain point you just have to be like move on and try to do better next time. So that's something I should have developed further, but I don't think I realized necessarily that it just didn't occur to me how much that didn't make sense, I guess, in the beginning. Which is another reason to get feedback from your scripts and stuff like that, which is something that I'm much better about now, but at that time not necessarily. Not really out of
There it is again.
arrogance or shyness necessarily, just
Definitely something. Maybe.
I changed so much from the storyboarding standpoint that I kind of feel like the script's not necessarily an accurate representation, but it's a good way to raise those questions and stuff anyway. So even if you know you're going to make changes, and even if you trust yourself to be self-critical, get extra eyes on everything you do, guys, for sure. This is probably the next scene that, if it wasn't the scene in the cave, it was this scene that I thought of first. Just because this is another classic cliche that I had to homage. The couple making out in the car gets attacked by a monster. I really like that. I'm also pretty happy with the way this whole bit turns out, actually. I think in general this scene goes pretty well, if I may say. I think the hazard-like joke though, I don't think quite lands. I still like the idea, but I think I could have done the actual light effect a bit better so it stands out more. I don't know how obvious it is to everybody watching that that's what he did when he said I have an idea. But live and learn. The shadows that this window is casting on the room don't make a lot of sense. But this is a case where I don't care. because I think it looks cool and it makes the shot more visually interesting. Especially because this is a pretty big cavernous guest room. Like I don't know how much money the doohickeys are throwing around here, but they're doing pretty well. You notice too, by the way, it's almost all blues in the doohickey house. That's because he's a cop. You get it? On the bedside table there was a photo of the doohickeys with their baby boy.
Hello, Doctor.
Jack Jr. was introduced in a deleted scene. And he's black. And the joke being, of course, that Sarah has been cheating on Sheriff Doohickey for a long time, and he's completely oblivious to it. But I decided the scene where that character was introduced, I didn't think necessarily was worth keeping, and I just wanted to try to trim things down, get it moving at a brisker pace. So that's how we ended up here. On the TV there was actually one of the teaser trailers I had made for the movie. Griswell Predicts, which is a parody on Criswell Predicts, who was a TV personality at the time, and he also appeared in Plan 9 from Outer Space and stuff. I think this dog might be up there on my more favorite character designs as well, because it's a pretty frickin' adorable dog. I'll mention now the original script and storyboard. The dog died along with the old guy, and it came up in conversation, and someone gave me shit for it. They said, "You can't kill a dog." So I thought about it, and I came up with a joke to put in the crime scene that comes later on when the police are investigating. They find out the dog's alive, and there was kind of a joke to go along with it. And then the dialogue necessary for that joke didn't get recorded. I had a character, June Park. By the way, that's Sam Glennie as the old guy. June Park does the voice of the Snot monster, all the growls and stuff like that, but he's also one of the cops that we're going to meet soon. And I had given his character this line of dialogue that was going to address the absurdity that the Snot would somehow let the dog survive, and it was supposed to be kind of almost a fourth wall break. But it was a handwritten addition to the script that ended up not being on his script copies, so we totally missed it at the recording session, and it took way too much effort to get and time before our schedules lined up to get June recording. So I came up with something different so that Dana could say the joke, because I could record that myself and not be a big deal. And it doesn't land nearly. I still think the original joke was decent, not that I remember it offhand, but it was a better, more true fourth wall break. By the way, Dana has 4 fingers. All the characters have 4 fingers, and 5 with the thumb. But his hand on the thing there, I repurposed an existing hand asset, and I really should have altered it to keep that pinky on there, because it kind of looks like he lost a finger or something in the back part.
It's moving fast. It's giving me the heart count any second. Must check the other scene. Let's go.
Doohickeys' arms, by the way, are a good example of what I was saying about how I really pushed the proportions a lot, where I was like, if it's going to be small, it's going to be really small. If it's going to be big, it's going to be really big. Because he's got these like tiny toothpick arms and this giant belly and everything, right? So I did it to everybody, but it stands out a lot more with the girls there for sure.
Mary Bell? Mary Bell, what is it? What's wrong?
Oh, Bonnie, it's Sally. It's my sister.
Kind of like this setup with Mary Bell. It's a simple setup, but with the cat clock and the
Bell, I'm sure she just lost track.
wallpaper, that's kind of cool. Now there's a gag here with Mary Bell. She's got a different kind of food in her hand every time we cut back to her, and this was kind of
Mary Bell, I'm coming over. I'll be there as soon as I can, and I'll stay there until Sally comes home.
almost, I'll just come out and say it, almost verbatim ripped off of a Naked Gun joke, where George Kennedy is eating stuff. It's like he's nervously eating, and every time he reaches his hand off the screen, he pulls up some different piece of food. So that's what that was supposed to be. I worried a little bit after the fact if it might be seen as a fat joke. It was definitely not intended to be that. I like the gag, but sometimes you gotta be worried about how things could be taken. And so, in hindsight, I hope that wasn't taken that way, because I do like the joke, and it was meant to be pretty harmless. I like that cut. I think that worked pretty well. By the way, I haven't necessarily been pointing out all the songs in the background here. I'll maybe go through them later in the credits, but this one's Marine Braun. This scene, by the way, was going to be something else. I think it was an old woman. I don't even remember exactly what it was, but in the script it was sort of like I was using these murder scenes, basically, of the Snot picking people up as almost like a transitional scene. So like every time we would go from Dana to Bonnie or vice versa, there would be some other attack in the middle. And so I needed something here, and I didn't really have any ideas originally. So in the script it was like, I think it was an old woman. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it played out pretty similarly to the old man with the dog, and I was never thrilled with it. And then at some point I had this idea. So I did and I like this a lot better. I like the gag of him getting pulled into the ball return. I think it's ridiculous in a good way. And I like the frill cream gag. And also the bowling alley was a big thing in the 50s, and I didn't have that. So any opportunity to kind of lean into some 1950s cliche, right? I watched a lot of not only 50s monster movies, but just movies from the 50s to try to help me design the aesthetic. And I actually found stuff like Grease or Back to the Future was actually more helpful, because movies made in the 50s were, they kind of take that, you know, it's the joke I was talking about, they kind of takes the aesthetic for granted, because that's just the way the world was at the time, right? But stuff that was from later, like 70s, 80s, 90s, but set in the 50s, they really lean into all those tropes, so you kind of get a little bit more out of them that you can really lean into in the same way. That's another good riff from Luke for his reveal. Some decent animation here between these two. This is another one that I amped up a little bit. Gave Bonnie a bit more smart-ass comments. She always had that one, but later on there's a Lizzie Borden joke and stuff. And she always fought him off. But when I actually went to animate this scene, I went a lot farther with it. So she isn't just... I think before she just slapped him and then walked off. Now she slaps him, punches him, knees him in the face. And then throws a cigarette back at him, I think, as well.
Willie was a nobody. I'm your soulmate, Bunny. It's always been me.
I still like the idea of her reflection in his greasy hair. I don't know that it works exactly the way that I was intending. Probably could have done the effect a little bit better.
Hey! What's the big idea?
I told you, I'm not interested.
Also her try it, see what happens line.
Nobody treats me that way, Bunny. Do you hear me? Nobody.
You notice too, some of the retake dialogue, or the stuff that was recorded much later, sometimes the quality of it isn't quite the same. It's a little bit more tinny and stuff. It's because what I did initially, I took advantage of the fact that my parents were out of town at one point, and I watched a bunch of videos on YouTube, and I turned their dining room into a recording studio. I hung up cloth all over the place to absorb sound so there wouldn't be an echo. And I think it worked pretty well. In fact, I think it worked really well. But then for some of the retakes, or for some people who I wasn't able to record at that time, the conditions weren't the same necessarily, and it stands out, I think, sometimes. Some just by happy accident, it's not that bad. Like Sean wasn't recorded till much later, and I think he sounds pretty good. But like when Megan did her retakes, it was in my studio apartment, which was kind of echoey, and so you can definitely hear that. I don't think it sounds terrible necessarily, but when you hear it next to one of the lines that was recorded in that makeshift recording studio, definitely a big difference. These are the scenes that I had the most fun storyboarding and probably animating as well. Just the creepy there's the monster out there, but you don't know how. You don't know where it's going to attack or how it's going to attack, what's it's going to do, is she going to survive? She's our main character, so we're pretty sure she's going to survive, but still. By the way, the snot is made up of 3 different layers. There's the layer that is most prominent, which is the green, right? And then underneath that, there is a slightly smaller yellow blob, which was made by just by copying and pasting it and then reducing the size, so it's a little bit smaller. And then underneath that is a mask layer that shows a copy of whatever was behind the snot, but just confined to that one little piece. And then the upper layer, an opacity was put on it, and as well as a bevel and emboss to give it a little bit of a rounded edge. And then the yellow part was blurred with like a warp effect put on it. So if you look closely for some of the shots, you can see it's kind of doing this a little bit. And then the mask layer, which is blurred, so that you were kind of seeing through it, but the environment you were seeing underneath it was distorted. And then you can sort of see this like center element, basically.
This was no bowling accident.
That's supposed to be a nod to Jaws. This was no boating accident.
Bonnie was hacked by what? They're not sure. All they can do is calm her down and not fall asleep.
I love how much these characters in the background don't give a shit that their friend was just killed. But they didn't care that he got a strike either, so. And I also like how little Dana seems to care about that severed arm that he just pulled out as well.
I lived to tell about it. We had to speak with her immediately.
It's a nonchalance of extreme circumstances that I think is kind of a fun gag to play with.
Probably wouldn't have her wits about her anyhow.
By the way, another thing too with the blonde-haired deputy there that June does, he's supposed to be chewing tobacco, and he's always hard to understand because of his mouth being full of the tobacco. I think that's a fun idea that does not land at all. And that's my fault. I should have gotten him to say the line but garbled, but instead of like just make a weird noise, it'll work as a joke, and then it didn't, in my opinion.
Thanks for coming to see me, guys.
Don't mention it, Bonnie.
Bonnie, are you sure you don't want me to call Dr. Neptune? No thanks, Mom. I'm okay. Have you heard from Mary Belle at all? I was on my way to see her last night when it happened.
Your sister never did come home last night. She wanted to be there too, Bonnie, but she had to be at home.
I understand.
So what is it, Bonnie?
I had fun designing Bonnie's background. The idea is that like her bedroom, I mean, like the idea is that she's into movies, she's into music, but she's also more importantly into travel. She's got like tourism posters everywhere to kind of show that while her friends are all about like finding a boy, she's all about like implied anyway, without coming out and saying it, implying that maybe she wants to see the world.
Hello, girls. You might remember
Most of
me
which are
from
inspired by
yesterday.
actual tourism posters and stuff I could find from the 50s.
Hi. I'm guessing this must be Bonnie. How are you feeling? Sounds like you had some excitement.
I'm okay, I guess.
Your dad tells me
And there's she's just got like horror comics and stuff as well, which maybe would go against the norm. Recording this dialogue, by the way, was very funny.
I'm
Tiff and
not
Andrea
really that kind of girl.
laughed a lot at the overly flirtatious dialogue. And by the way, I'll also mention too that
So Bonnie,
it at no point
happened last night.
during the writing, storyboarding, animating, recording, or any of this movie
Distracted by something.
was the intention to be that Dana and Bonnie would ever like wind up together. This is not meant to be any kind of
Or at least not at first.
romantic interest between the two of them. They're just people that happen to be in the same situation. But I am aware that some might take it that way. So I did make a point of suggesting that Bonnie was 18, only so that if people
It looked like Bonnie.
interpret it that way,
What was it?
at the very least it's legal. But it is not my intention that these two would ever end up together. They have a bonding moment, but it's supposed to be platonic, guys.
Sure, if your allergies, it makes perfect sense. Did you see
But I got that because her friends are so like into him that the fact that they get like chummy might be taken that way.
I probably did.
Sandra D's nipple. Thanks to the meteorite's radiation. A living, breathing
Doing these like color card backgrounds and stuff
it hungers for food.
it's inspired by like 50s comic books more than anything. It's prominent in Creepshow as well, which was also inspired by those. I kind of wish it did a bit more of that kind of stuff, but it was sort of an afterthought, and it was kind of like, okay, rule of threes. As long as you do it 3 times, it's not completely random. But I think I could have probably had some fun with stylizing things a little bit more in a similar fashion.
I'm the doctor here.
McCarthy showing up at this moment probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but it feels like it makes sense for the world and the movies that it's referencing.
But this has become a matter of national security, and the military must take the lead in
Just another one of Bonnie's smart-ass things I added later on.
Not deserve to be poked and prodded at like some sort of lab experiment.
What's going on?
Bonnie, oh my god.
I don't know what's going on, Mom.
Mr. and Mrs. Corman, the general
I
here
think
wants to take
her
all
parents
the
had more dialogue in this scene originally as well that I cut down. Keep things, try to keep things a little bit
and I will not allow
snappier. Actually, another scene that was cut came before this as well, where Dana references in the bowling alley that he's going to call McCarthy. And there actually was a scene where he does call McCarthy, and it was all shown from McCarthy's standpoint. It was in his office, and he answers the phone, and you only heard his side of the conversation. And then I eventually realized it was just completely unnecessary. The main reason I came up with the whole like disguise bit was so I could have that moment where he's revealed to have been in the room, and you're just kind of like, was he there the whole time? Did they bring in this piece of furniture just to reveal him later on? I don't know, but
Wake up, man. All American towns are a hotbed of supernatural and paranormal activity.
good echo going on in this scene. There are a few standout shots in this that I'm still pretty proud of. One of them is when this door opens pretty soon. And actually, even these ones build up leading up to it, like just being so giant and cavernous and stuff. But another one would be the car on the edge of the cliff. Some other ones with the monster coming up later on. That is probably my favorite joke in the entire movie. I'm very proud of that joke. I am still proud of that joke. I will defend that joke. And then yeah, I think this is pretty cool. I maybe hold on it a little bit too long, but I was just like, I like the shot. It's a cool shot. Perspective in this is a little wonky, but I kind of get away with it. Every single shot in this underground facility has a lens flare on it, by the way, just to make everything feel more overly glossy and shiny and white and clean and stuff. It was a very conscious decision. This is kind of where I was able to run the most wild with background references to other sci-fi movies and stuff.
On hand her. General, these men have no right to treat this girl this way. Like she's one of these creatures you have down here.
I say, man, I used to steal another spot of tea over shop.
No harm should come to it.
I don't mind that gag either.
It's imperative that we conduct our experiments.
I also like the brain in the water cooler.
We have reason to believe that the
I can be proud of some jokes, even if I'm tearing apart a lot of it.
Continues to grow, it could wipe out the
That's Brad Watson on the left, by the way. Brad Watson and Dave Lahr on the left, and as he's credited, and
General, you have
Eddie on the right. Eddie. Well, you get the last name from it. So it's these kind of monologues that I think I had kind of fun writing with McCarthy. And the back wall, by the way, are inspired by like actual computers from the 50s that were just like these oversized things. So I just kind of thought, what if they just kind of lined the entire environment with these types of things? And then, yeah. And now this is, if you Google 1950s pulp magazines or sci-fi pulp magazines, you will find so many covers that have a woman wearing little to no clothing suspended inside of a tube like that. And so I thought, well, I gotta do that. I gotta have my gag. And that's why it's referred to as the Tropatron as well. It went through a lot of different names.
It's ludicrous. Mucus that size would tear through any amount of tissue, like hot knife through butter.
That's Megan again, the Russian voice. Eddie Howe, by the way. I started to say the name and then I kind of cut myself off. Eddie Howe is the...
Oh, you daft man. Snot can't be controlled.
I should have jacked up the sound of that slap. There's Mandy again. This is another one where I think I saw it as, you know, some of the dialogue's funny, but most of it is just exposition and stuff. So I just threw as many background gags as I can. So I have the one guy reading the Playboy, kind of, you know, there's servers coming around delivering food all the time. One guy's playing solitaire. Filing his nails.
Nothing but that of your comic books. I have designed a device. A weapon which uses
Those are all the concept sketches, by the way. The nasal ray was the other area where I did a lot of designs for.
I call it the nasal ray.
That's why we call it anyway. Unless someone has something better up their sleeve, we move forward on the weapon immediately.
This is a matter of national security. Before we set any plan into action, we must
Sam
consult
again.
the presidents.
Mr. President! Mr. President!
I told you I'll be out in a minute.
Hell with it. Nasal ray can't live. Now.
Showing a president on the toilet, it's never a bad gag, I feel like.
What?
All these scientists, by the way, are supposed to be, they're inspired by directors at the time that specifically did monster movies, except for the women, because there weren't many, or at least that I could find, that I was aware of anyway, that directed those types of movies at the time. There's unfortunately not that many women that were directing at all at that time, let alone that type of movie. And I didn't want the scientists to be all men, so they're inspired by actresses at the time. But there's Roger Corman is one of them. That guy there with the cigar is William Castle. The guy with the pink shirt is Ed Wood. I was the idea that it's just like another guy disguised as him for like no reason at all. That's Randy Paul. Eddie was also supposed to be this guy, but there was a mix-up when he recorded, and I wasn't able to use it, unfortunately. And again, I just needed to keep things moving. That cave is supposed to resemble nostrils with nose hairs. That's why so many of the stalactites are all bendy and stuff. This is very much rule of cool. The only reason Hetty is alive here is for the sake of the imagery. I don't have any idea why the Snot creature would keep her alive. But I thought it would be a cool image. It kind of leans into a lot of the tropes that I'm parodying and stuff. And then it was also a way to tease that the Snot is probably pretty close to this facility where they're hiding out.
Dr. Stanley, what are you doing?
Because remember, these characters, the only ones that have really seen the Snot in the cave are now dead or captured. So
Insane. Who wants to use you in a barbaric attempt of attracting the monster where they can attack it?
there was
A weapon to stop them.
a heavily exaggerated boob jiggle there that I don't think I ever caught before. I think that's purely an accident. I almost wondered if the timing got thrown off, and that's what made it look. So that's supposed to be I Love Lucy there, and I originally tried to record myself doing a Desi Arnaz impression, and it did not go well, so it ended up being silent. It sounded horrible.
We need to go now.
Accurate.
It's here! We're under attack!
Try to experiment with messing around with color balance and stuff a lot later on to just really like try to make the different scenes feel different from one another as much as possible, or different locations at least. So I think having the red light coming through too when it reopens was part of that. It was kind of cool. I bet that hurt. So this shot right here, that is the first shot I animated for the entire thing. So I started with that shot and I went through to the end. Then I went back to the beginning, animated up to this point, and then I went back to the ending scene and I added a bunch of stuff to try to make it stronger from a narrative standpoint, and to give Bonnie a little bit more obstacles and things to go through. I like that poster. Like I said, making background posters and magazine covers and stuff like that is like probably one of my favorite things to do when I'm designing this kind of stuff. And I thought this was a fun idea. As a nod to Billy the Kid meets Dracula, or Jesse James meets Frankenstein's daughter and stuff, you gotta have a rocking car at the drive-in, of course. Kind of wish I'd written and recorded more background stuff for the movie, though, so that it wasn't just the music and stuff. And then there's the big moment. I feel like I could have got more out of that. I still haven't quite figured out what I should have done differently. To be honest, I haven't put a lot of thought into it, but I kind of, in hindsight, I'm kind of like, it wasn't quite the big holy shit moment that I think I'd envisioned it to be. But I've been pointing out things that I wish I had done differently through the whole thing. So maybe if the moment was earned in a slightly different way, it would have been a whole other ball game, of course. Like that, just loses his pants entirely. So this is kind of supposed to be a nod to, well, not really a nod, but inspired heavily by Edgar Wright with the fast cutting there and stuff. So this car is the only bit of 3D animation in the entire thing. Just so I could do this kind of stuff. I think it turned out pretty well. I think it would work a little bit better if we had a bit more in the way of line work on the car, I think. But it ultimately still works pretty well, I think, for the effect that it needed to be. And masking these characters to be inside of it was a nightmare. That shot is blatantly lifted from Jurassic Park. I like that shot as well. That works pretty well. That devil head in the foreground is a nod to an episode of Twilight Zone again. So yeah, this mayhem that is about to ensue, it just took so much time. The reason I started with the climax was because I knew that this was something that I might want to do a lot of editing with, and I might want to trim things down and stuff. So I thought, I'm gonna animate that first, do all the effects, composite it all, edit it together, then do the rest of the stuff, and then I could come back with fresh eyes and edit it again. And I think it is good that I did that, because that's why I ended up adding as much as I did to the sequence later on. But there's so much going on. Plus the Snot itself, once you see the Snot in its entirety like you are here, it's drawn entirely frame by frame. Which if I was to do now, would be, I mean, it would still be more work than the cutout, but it wouldn't be completely unmanageable. And the reason I say that is because I now have a hue on. I can draw right on the screen. I didn't have that at the time. I had to do all the Wacom, which is very counterintuitive to work with. It's where you're kind of drawing on your lap and looking at the screen. And some people practice with it and do it a lot, and they get really good with it. But I generally prefer to draw on paper, so it wasn't the easiest thing. And I kind of got away with it because it's this gelatinous blob, and the features are, you know, not super defined and stuff anyway. but it it made it a lot. It was a very cumbersome thing to work on. So somewhere among my mountain of files, there is a very different cut of this climax. I moved stuff around a lot. I made a lot of changes as I went. And then also, like, you'll notice that it starts out at night, and you've got the purple and the blue and the stars in the background. And in the middle, there's kind of the sunrise setting where it's kind of yellow and pink in the sky. And then at the end, it's like morning lighting. And so as I edited, I would constantly have to go and change the lighting in the sky to match whatever I was going with at that point. That whole shit giant mucus thing, by the way, that's supposed to be a nod to Godzilla. I don't think that joke really lands, but I figured I had to do some sort of Godzilla joke for the sake of a 50s monster thing. See, that scene was added later just to give Bonnie more in the way of hero moments. Like I said, the intent was always that she would kind of ultimately be the hero, but once it was coming together, it didn't really feel like it. Like she really was being the hero. So I added moments like that wherever I could. I am undecided on this gag. Like, the movie's so silly and lighthearted, and yet there are moments during this climax where some of these deaths are pretty graphic, and I don't know how people maybe feel about that. I don't know if it seems a little bit too dark all of a sudden. I mean, there are a lot of horror comedies that are very gory, but like there's not a ton of it in here. So when it does, it maybe feels very out of left field. I don't know. The little signs in the background, a lot of them just say pun or witty gag, because I knew they were going to whip by too fast for everybody to read anyway. So I thought, let's lean into it. Let's make a joke out of it.
I'm told now that the military hasn't yet arrived in aid of the town of Ordinary. So far, their forces appear to be useless against the creature.
That's a good shot. I think that one works pretty well. And I used that as a transitional shot as well, so that's, you'll notice after that the lighting looks a little bit different. There we go. I think that's a cool shot as well for it. Again, a huge part of what makes this sequence work is Luke's music. So way to go, Luke. Great work.
Thank God you're okay.
Jack's not your
Just barely recognizing that. Look how weird their faces are there. That was me trying to cut a corner that I never should have cut by distorting the assets I had instead of redrawing the angle. So, not mistakes I would make again. But I think it's easy to start telling yourself that no one's going to notice because shots are going so fast sometimes. Because when you're working yourself to the bone to get some of the stuff done, you know. And you don't really realize exactly what how obvious some of those are. I don't know if there's a lot that stand out to that extent. I think most of it is more my own nitpicking, but like there are definitely some moments where it's just like, whoa, what were you thinking there?
Step away from the mucus. The situation is under control. The situation is under control. Step away from the mucus. The situation is under control.
Somehow I doubt that.
You notice progression too. There's a flaming motorcycle that goes by at one point, a flaming bicycle that goes by at one point, and a flaming unicycle that goes by at one point. By the way, I always had this idea that Bonnie would be running barefoot through all this because I thought it made her look that much more badass because it's gotta hurt, right? And she's doing it and not paying it any mind. I had a lot of fun coming up with ways that he could destroy shit, by the way. But anyway, so yeah, so I thought later from a design standpoint, it would have been cooler if instead of wearing heels, she was wearing sneakers. She could be wearing the girly dress, but still have the sneakers. I think it would have been a cooler look. I think it would have said something about her character in a good way. But I had already had it in mind that she would be wearing something impractical, so she would have to then be barefoot during the fight, or during the climax, which would just make her seem that much tougher to be enduring that. Kind of like John McClane in Die Hard kind of thing. Was the mindset. There's a post-credit scene where you see her tying shoes, and that's why that's there, is because I had that idea much later, and it didn't really make sense to add that. Like I would have had to change so much animation to justify that. This is a pretty good death for our asshole general that we've been dealing with this entire time. Yeah, putting this sequence together was kind of like just a kid playing with G.I. Joes and Lego and shit. Let's just like build stuff and then blow it up was kind of the whole idea. Hold there. Double blinks.
It absorbs excess oxygen in the raised energy chamber to stop the expansion and combustion of the core turbine. It sucks the air out. Without it, it won't work.
I almost changed a joke around here that would have been a nod to Airplane even more, where he does the kick me in the testicle line and then she says, "What is it?" And then I almost thought about him saying, "It's a reproductive organ, but that's not important right now." And I thought, nah, I'll leave it alone.
Oh my god, help me! Don't worry, I won't let anything happen to you. Hey, do I know you? Is that vacuum?
Why, as a matter of fact, it is. You know, there's nothing more dangerous in the common household.
Thanks. That's 1775.
So this was something that was added in the storyboarding and stuff kind of late, like I was saying, added the whole vacuum thing. But she goes through a lot of shit before she gets it back to the nasal ray, and that was added way later, after everything had been animated. I said, okay, let's give her a bit more. So this is a good point to talk about something else I wish I had done differently. So I mentioned how it doesn't make a lot of sense that the Snot would steal the meteorite and not do anything with it. And what I thought later was that what I should have done is the meteorite should have essentially been like the brain or heart of the Snot. So it's like floating inside of it the entire time it's out there rampaging and stuff. And that's why it disappeared at the scene, because the Snot would have engulfed it and then grown and then carried it away as part of itself. And then when the nasal ray didn't work, I would have either skipped the whole vacuum thing, or I still would have done the vacuum thing, but then the vacuum thing also didn't work. And Bonnie's big hero moment was going to be, she was going to get like a big piece of like wrought iron or something from the rubble, and then get up on the roof of a building, and then jump on the Snot, leading with this rod that would then cut into the Snot and then through the meteorite as if it was like piercing its heart essentially, and that's how she would have stopped it. And I think that would have been very cool, and it would have made the storytelling a bit tighter as well, because it would have explained the meteorite thing. But I thought of this when the movie was like 90% finished, and I was like I said, I burnt myself out at that point like a few times over, and I would have had to redo so much stuff. I would have had to re-record a bunch of dialogue to kind of set that up and make it make sense and everything. And it would have been a really difficult thing to pull off, and it was just I had to kind of look at it in a more practical way at that point and decide not to do it, in the interest of moving on with my life essentially. But here's something else weird. If you've seen James Gunn's The Suicide Squad, that ending that I just described, that this could have become, is essentially how they defeat Starro at the end of Suicide Squad. Harley Quinn runs along the buildings with a big staff spear and jumps into Starro, stabs through, goes right inside of him, and that's how she kind of ultimately like kills him. And so James Gunn put it on screen, and I didn't, but I had the idea first. Here's another one, by the way. I had this idea late in the game to have all these tendrils of Snot popping up, and I was like, okay, I can do that. But her animation is like, she's kind of doing the cycle, and the cycle of the run is just kind of going around these tendrils as they pop up, but she really should be reacting a little bit more to them. This is also one that came up later. It's fairly well animated, I guess. It could have been a lot faster and a bit more lively. Like, it's not amazing, like it's functioning animation, I should say. But I could have taken it a lot farther, gotten a lot more out of it.
Hi, host Silver. I believe it will. Good work, Bonnie.
She just takes off right away. She doesn't know why at first, but she knows exactly what she's doing. Now this was always in there. Bonnie always distracted the Snot so they could get a shot. Like the nasal ray always got kind of damaged, but he was able to fix it. He didn't need the vacuum cleaner. They just had to get it re-aimed and recalibrated essentially. And then she always kind of had this hero moment of playing bait essentially. But that was essentially her only hero moment, which is why I added the vacuum cleaner and then all this other stuff. Again, I gotta say how strong Luke's music is. It really goes a long way to keep this all. Like, I like to think I had something to do with it, but I don't. If I didn't have his music on top of this, I think there actually is some genuine suspense happening at this moment, and I think the music is, it's at least half of that, but it's honestly probably more than half that. That it is getting more and more opaque. It's kind of going in and out. It's getting less transparent, then more transparent, then less transparent, and now it's fully transparent. There was another thing at one point I played with, an idea. I even did some concept art for it, where after this moment happened, I then thought, what if chunks of the monster broke off and became essentially little booger monsters, and then you would kind of have this whole new sequence of them having to fight off all these like kind of gremlin-like monsters, which seemed like a fun idea, just like going as pulpy with it as possible, like just you out of one scrape and then into another, and I think it was a fun idea, but it was like almost everything else that happens in the movie was still in that version of the script, and it was sort of like, if I do that, then I probably gotta spend another 10 minutes or at least before they defeat, because if they defeat them too fast, it's like, why do it at all? So you gotta get some drama out of it. They have to put up a fight, and then it's just like, this whole thing's just gonna be so slow at this point. So again, this is supposed to be them embracing. This isn't supposed to be anything romantic between them, but you guys have gone through this kind of hell together. I don't think a hug is uncalled for. And I didn't want to not do it, but I do recognize that some people might read into that, but that is not the intention. I will reiterate. Like I said, Invasion of the Bystanders has been playing out in the background this entire time, so that's the final beat of Invasion of the Bystanders. And then there we go. So that is the end. So like I said, I would probably, there is a lot in it that I would have kept from a writing standpoint, but I would have changed a lot of other stuff to make the stuff that I would have kept probably worked a little bit better. And I would have designed things differently, would have animated things differently. The biggest thing though is, if you have a team of people behind you, then obviously I would not have been stretched as thin as I was doing it all myself. I would have been, and I would have also been a lot more self-critical if I didn't feel like I just gotta keep things moving. I just gotta keep going, you know. But then also that team would help keep you accountable. Everybody can be looking at each other's work. We can critique each other and all that stuff. So it would have been a much better way to go about it. Animation's a lot of work, and I didn't want to ask anybody to do it for free, and I still would never ask anybody to do that kind of thing for free. So I do hope to do another one of these someday. But when if and when I do, I will get myself a budget to play with, so I can get a team together. I definitely think I have another movie in me, but I want to do it. I want to do it right, like a full production. I want to, whether it's crowdfunding or getting a grant or raising the money in some other way. I want to take that leap at some point and do at least one more of these with a proper production pipeline and learn from all of these mistakes. This was a fun thing to add at the end here, by the way, as well. I don't know at what point I thought to do this, but it was kind of fun. I just like the idea of doing this kind of mock teaser trailer for another B movie that I couldn't parody these types of movies in the movie because the movie's from the 50s, but it's set in the 19th century. It doesn't, two things can't really work, but as a movie inside of a movie, it kind of works. I also really leaned into shitty effects, sound effects and stuff. Oh, what the? Something kind of weird happened there as I was watching, but we can kind of continue on with everything. So I definitely would encourage you guys to check out all of the songs and musicians that you'll see credited along here as they're going by. You're gonna notice Noreen Braun, the Ballantines. The Ballantines is a Vancouver-based band that I did a music video for. And they didn't have a huge budget to work with, and they said, well, would you be able to do it for this much? And I was like, sure, but can I use a couple of your songs in a project I'm working on? They said yes, which worked out really well. The trick was, like, I couldn't license movies, or music, sorry, to use in the movie. I couldn't license the stuff, but I could find indie bands that already had music that maybe fit the vibe of the 50s, and sometimes you're not as on the nose, but it's a little 60s-ish, but it's close enough kind of thing. And I'm just sort of like, they're not doing any added work for me. I'm not asking them to write and record anything. But if they already have it and they're willing, then I'll do my best to promote them and everything like that. So by their inclusion in the movie. So I also offered them some artwork in exchange as well. Not all of them took me up on it, but I did do a drawing for each of them anyway. But also said, you know, if you need to do something for something, do something. And I think Noreen's maybe the only one that really took me up on that, actually. But yeah, there's Noreen, there's the Ballantines, there's the Dark Corners, there's the Yetis, there's Flamingo Chicks, and it might be. Yeah, so I encourage you guys to check all that out. Another thing I would do differently, one more thing that I'm going to throw out there at the very end is I would do differently is I think doing something like a monster movie in the 50s is cool. Doing a film noir movie in the 40s is cool, like I said, like I did before, and I would play in either of those sandboxes again, I think, but I wouldn't base it so rooted in parody. I would do it. I wouldn't really parody other movies again. I don't think I would do that, but I might play in that sandbox, but do it a wholly original movie. And like, I think I sometimes, in both cases, held myself so closely to parodying the movies of that era that I sometimes ignored like kind of more modern filmmaking stuff, including like the pacing and stuff like that. And like I said right off the top, we don't have the same attention spans that we did in the 40s and 50s, and so I think to do something that adheres itself so much to that type of structure, I think was a mistake. So that's something else I would kind of do differently. But anyway, that's it. That's the entire movie. We've seen the whole thing. I'm gonna be totally honest with you guys. My video cut out, and I haven't had the credits playing in front of me, so I legitimately don't know at the moment if the credits are still scrolling or if it stopped a while ago. And I'm being honest so that when I stop talking, if it doesn't line up perfectly, you'll understand why. Yeah, I hope you liked. I hope you liked the movie, or learned something maybe from this commentary, and hopefully I'll do this again with a team behind me and do it much bigger and better all across the board, and hopefully you guys will be there to see that in whatever shape that takes on. So thanks for watching, everybody, and have a good one.
Running